Hi guys, this is Fernando doing another video for the Modern Survivalist. In this case I'm going to be talking about big knives, their uses, their importance for you as someone interested in survival and preparedness, as someone that wants to be ready for small and large inconveniences of life in general. There's plenty of videos about knives on YouTube. I do my own reviews as well. I haven't found yet a good video explaining why it is and why it is an advantage to have a bigger knife in comparison to some of the smaller ones. Some videos are better than others. Haven't found quite what I was looking for. So this is my stab. Get it? My stab at it. Yeah. Well, the thing is, there's sometimes you see people saying, okay, no, if you have a bigger knife, it's because you have some inferiority complex of some sort. You're usually better off with a little tiny knife, something like this, which is good but has its limitations. Yeah, a big knife is, it's because you want to be Rambo, or you're uncertain or unsure about your manhood, or something similar, something in that line. Then there's good stuff. There's some stuff that isn't that great, but not completely explaining. Thing is, you have people have some experience. I have my experience with knives as well. I've been collecting knives since I was very little. Have been into knives since I was 8 years old, give or take. My grandparents, they were both sides of the family were carpenters, so sharp objects and crafts and using your hands to build stuff was something in the family already. So it's something that I basically grew up with. Also, there's a fact about personal experience only reaching a certain point. You can have experience, but is that the end of all things? Is your personal experience the decisive factor of the decisions you make? I don't think so. I think that while your experience is important, the person that has a bit more of an evolution in these sort of things does lots of research. Research being a keyword that I see that lots of the things out there fail to do. I did a good amount of research myself about knives in general when I was writing my book. Here it is, the Modern Survival Manual, Surviving Economic Collapse. For this book, I was covering stuff that it's mostly a survival manual, urban survival manual based on the experience of my experience in Argentina, but I wanted to go a bit further in the part of knives, and especially knives for defense, because why? Because I thought that lots of people don't have guns. Lots of people live in countries where guns are a bit more complicated to get. The only thing most people, I'm sure everyone has in common, is that everyone has one of these in their kitchen, or something very similar, right? Ordinary chef knife. And if you have something like this, like 8 or 9-inch long knife, you have a weapon in your house. And you don't have to be a super martial artist, genius, latest ninja to use it to defend yourself. It's actually one of the tools that require the less amount of skill, just a good amount of determination. That's why I thought it was important to cover it, so as to give people right away a tool they could use in their defense if it ever came down to that. In my research, I read many books. One of the books that I found to be the most interesting is this one I'm showing you here. It's called Esgrima Criolla. It's in Spanish only. It's written by a guy called Mario Lopez Osornio. I went to this book after reading another book by a well-known Argentine knife reviewer and knife journalist, and he mentioned this book. This book its first edition was in 1942, give or take. Was about to spend a chunk of money buying the original edition, when suddenly, because of the popularity of this other guy's book, they did a second print on it, and that saved me a chunk of money because it was awfully expensive buying the original one. What is the nice thing about it? That it does go into further detail about the use of knives among gauchos. Gauchos being the Argentine and South American equivalent of the cowboys. All right, I thought it was a great opportunity to learn from people that didn't just go out for a weekend, or didn't just go out for a week, a month. People that actually live their entire lives in the outdoors, in the pampas, in the southern regions where it's more there's greater amount of forests in the mountains. Argentina and South America has a wide variety of environments. You have everything from deserts to tropical jungle and everything in between. So I thought it was a good moment, a good opportunity to learn from people that have not only been there, done that, but lived that their entire lives. Sometimes we fail to see the importance of that, of doing proper research and learning. What I have here is a few big knives. Guys, if you haven't detected already, this is going to be a long video. If you don't have enough time, I'm sorry, but this is the way it's going to be. It's going to be pretty long. I have here 3 knives. I have a facón, which is what gauchos, the South American equivalent of cowboys, use. A facón, slightly modified by myself, machete, and a bigger trade knife. These are knives that have been used a lot. This is a knife that was bought new by myself. It was originally a Tramontina machete. Machetes are used pretty frequently in South America. I modified it, adding it a clip point as best as I could. I did this, I think, when I was like 13 or 14 years old. I don't remember, but it was one of my first attempts in doing something on my own. It's very, coarsely made, not very fine or anything, but it did its job, and I use this knife a lot. You see how it has this kind of patina because of different rust. This one I bought in Argentina. I have a good amount of knives, I suppose. I'm not the biggest collector ever, but I know there's people that have tons of knives. I have I suppose a moderate amount of them for someone that is into knives, that's collecting them to some point. I must have about 80 pounds, maybe 90 pounds worth of knives. Those are the ones that I actually got to keep. I left many in Argentina. I gave away a lot of them. So 90 pounds is about the knives that I couldn't leave behind because of a reason or another, that I decided to stick with them. A facón knife. What did gauchos use it for? Everything and anything that you could possibly imagine. The thing to understand about gauchos is that in contrast with cowboys, gauchos rarely depended much on handguns, on firearms. They depended a lot on their facón, on their knife. As you can see, it's a rather big knife, about 10 inches, 15 inches could have been a typical. Between 10 and 14 inches, give or take, was a typical facón knife. They would also usually have a shorter knife as well. This was carried across the back in the belt, and they would have a shorter one called verijero for more detailed work carried in front. If they had only one, they will always have the bigger one. They knew perfectly well that you can get away with having a bigger one for smaller tasks, but a smaller knife will never compensate and do what a bigger knife can. So how is it that they would use it? For example, if they had to do something of carving and more detailed work, well, the way they did it was keeping the lower section of the blade not as sharp as the middle, and especially the tip. The tip was always kept very, very sharp, because if they had to do a bit more detailed work, they would grab it by the lower section of the blade and use it this way. A bit of care, not perfect, but with a bit of dedication you can actually put it off, and that's what they did. I'm going to be showing you a bit of more detail in the tip. Tip is very fine, as you can see. So what was the objective? The uses of the facón knife was used for everything from preparing shelter, preparing a fire, dressing game, cooking, doing a typical asado, barbecue, eating as well. They didn't use plates, they didn't use forks. The way the gauchos ate was just after cooking the meat on fire, they would just cut a chunk of it. Imagine this is your mouth, they bite it, holding it and cutting it that way, and they ate that chunk of meat they cut. That was the way of eating back in the day. Back in the day is a bit of an expression that may not be as accurate, because unlike cowboys, gauchos did hang on for a while, until I suppose about 50 years ago. Even today, if you go to some of the more, maybe they're not the typical gaucho that rarely ever set foot on anything that resemble a city. You still find guys that are very much out there in terms of living in the fields, in the country, and not being, they stick to those old costumes, those old traditions, I suppose. They still dress like typical gauchos pretty much did, except for a few differences here and there that would be a bit of a more detailed kind of conversation, but it's the knife very much stuck with them. And till this day, if you go to the countryside in Argentina and some places in South America, such as Brazil and other South American countries, you will find guys that have a facón across their back, such as this one. What is it that they use it back, as we were talking about, for eating? Did they use it for defense? Of course. This was as much of a tool as it was a weapon for defense. Defense, and something that has to be mentioned, the matter of honor was important back then. If you got challenged to a fight, you couldn't back away of it. You had to fight. And usually the duels were done with a knife. Instead of how you see with the cowboys that fought with their guns. Unlike the dueling that is usually very mystified by movies, it's well known, if you research a bit, you know that people didn't duel all day long. There would have been lots of dead people piling up pretty fast. On the contrary, gauchos did duel a lot. Because of honor, anything that was I laugh because I'm just thinking and picturing it in my head. Anything was good enough of an excuse to get into a matter of honor and fight each other with a knife. Darwin, in his trips to South America, he met the gauchos and he wrote quite a bit about them. He was very impressed by them, by the way they handled themselves, how they very much lived on top of a horse all day long, and how he mentions, that how disfigurated many of them were, having ears and noses cut off or severely mutilated because of this tradition of often dueling. The duels were not to death. If you were insulted in some way and you were involved in one of these, it was usually until first blood. The first one to draw blood was the one that won the encounter, and that was it. It was actually a dishonor to kill your adversary in one of these duels. It was said that you disgrace yourself if you killed someone in one of these duels. So unless it was a pure matter of true self-defense, unless it was you were very angry, very infuriated, blinded by rage, if not, you just didn't try to kill your adversary. If it was someone that you had some respect for, you would try to not cut him in the face, because getting cut in the face was reminder for the rest of your life that you had been beaten in one of those duels, of course. Not to mention the fact that you were disfigured for life. So let's take a look at the knife itself. About 10-12 inches long blade, clearly intended for fighting. You have a nice cross piece here. Some of the gauchos that were much into knife fighting preferred a U-shaped cross piece, because that was used to disarm your adversary if you had an amount of skill. And sometimes you see people talking crap all day long about for every YouTube account there's a YouTube expert on everything, knives, guns, and everything else. One of the quotes you see often is, no one wins a knife fight, and there's no such thing as knife fights. There's no such a thing as knife fights. Well, I suppose these guys they fought with knives for hundreds of years, their entire lives. But I suppose that there wasn't such a thing as knife fight. Well, in that hypothetical, impossible situation of a knife fight, some of them preferred the U crosspiece, because in the fight, having of course speed and dexterity, and I suppose mostly experience was what mattered a lot. They were able to disarm and block some of the attacks. One of the most common attacks was an overhead chop, you would block that with a cross piece. So it was pretty important to have one. What else do we see here? Well, nothing fancy in terms of the handle. It's not latest micarta stuff. It's actually, this is alpaca, which is a metal that it's not precious or anything, but just looks good. The fancier ones would have silver, even gold, and the way in which it was attached was filling up all this section with the melted tar. The tang goes through it and you hammer it on this end. Why is that? Because knives often got broken, and you would also often manage to save the grip and cross piece. So you would heat this and cut it over here and remove the blade, put a new blade and have it replaced, and not lose your precious handle. It was also a way, of course, of having precious metals with you. You know, it was a matter of status as well. If you had a fancy knife, it was a status symbol as well, but also true value because the precious metal is there. This knife I bought used. It has been used a lot in the way of it was intended to. The blade is Atahualpa. It's made in a place in Argentina called Tandil, and it says Industria Argentina. The blade is maybe, I don't know, 50, 60 years old. Not quite sure about it. I know it's not old. It's not the Dufour blade. It's not some of the older famous blades that are very expensive. Notice how it's rusted. This is a carbon blade, and you see there's no fancy epoxy finish, no nothing weird about it. And some people seem to have a heart attack when they see rust. It's not a matter of dying over it. Yeah, carbon steel blade that rusts, you just have to keep it cleaned as good as possible. Just being a bit careful is gonna be sparing your blade in spite of a bit of rust here and there. Sometimes when you see all these guys going nuts over, there's a bit of rust over here, look, or here, rust. Well, yeah, it's blades did rust a bit, and no one died because of that, and the blade doesn't lose any of its functionality because of that. Look at something here as well. See this? This isn't nanotech scabbard material. This is leather, all right? And still, did it work? Of course it worked. I'm gonna be talking about things that make no sense. Leather has been used for knife sheaths for thousands of years. Why it's not gonna be useful any less useful these days? Just have precautions and be careful with it. Don't throw it in a lake or something like that and leave it floating for a week. The advantage of having a larger blade is, of course, this is oriented as a weapon, but you could do several things that you cannot do with a smaller knife. You could, of course, chop with it. You can trim some of the branches of a piece of wood, a branch you're preparing. You can cut wood for a fire. You can cut wood for shelters. You can chop quite a bit much easier with a bigger blade than with a small one. With a small one, it may not be possible, which is something that I mentioned before. With something like this, something this size, 4 or 5 inch blade, you're not going to be able to chop with it, all right? Yet at the same time, with a bigger blade, you can do, as I said before, and just be careful not to cut yourself and do a bit more detail work. It's not going to be very practical, but it is possible, and possible is the key word. For making shelter, for hammering, for scrapping a bit, for digging, all those things were what the gaucho usually used his facón knife for. All right, let's keep looking at some of the other blades that I have here. What about this? A typical machete. Do South American people, Latins in general, have a use for a bigger knife? Of course, a machete is just that. It's a big knife. It's a big knife with a thinner blade because it's oriented for vegetation that isn't that hard, for greens that are easier to chop through as clearing your path through jungles, of course. It's a practical tool. It's a very practical tool. I modified it a bit because I didn't like the typical Latin tip of the machete, but it's still as practical as it was the first day I bought it. Do you need like a 1/4 inch spine for it to be useful? No, I have to be honest with that sort of things, folks. Sometimes it's a matter of the industry providing what people want. People like to have like the thickest blade in the planet because it makes them feel better about it. When you have such a wide section, a cross section such as this one, you don't necessarily need all the time a huge blade. Actually, with a blade such as this one, like a machete that's going to be used for chopping a lot through the green vegetation that isn't that hard, it's more of a matter of not getting tired, not getting your arm tired with a huge chunk of steel, because it's going to be cutting mostly because of its edge and because of the speed in which you use it, right? You're not chopping through a log where you need a huge cross section. Still practical and very useful for a number of things. You can, with all these knives, you have those capabilities that you lack in a smaller blade. In my research, I found out that every culture that has a significant use of knives, they will usually have a bigger blade and a smaller blade, because the bigger blade simply cannot be replaced by a small one. So they would usually have both. And if they had to get by with only one, they would go usually for something on the larger range of things. This is a trade knife, big trade knife that I bought back in Argentina. Yeah, very nice. It's what's a trade knife, in case you don't know what I'm talking about. A trade blade, a trade knife, it was brought to America mostly for commercial purposes. Often it was just a blade, and locally they would add whatever handle and grip or whatever other modifications in the continents, right? They would just import the blade. You find trade blades across North America. They were traded to, of course, the locals and the frontier guys. They had a good use for a knife. Take a look at the size of this thing. Is it, what, 12 inches, give or take? No less than 12 inches. Yeah. What about that? Is this a small little bushcrafty sort of knife? No. Handle material, bone, crosspiece, brass, S-shaped, protects the hand in case you are doing things in which your hand can get hurt. I wouldn't say this is something that had fighting much in mind, but could be used for it as well. Why not? Look at the tip, penetrates well. Spine, thick enough in my opinion. If you're bit of a fanatic in terms of thickness of blade, this may not be that wide. It's maybe 3 millimeters thick. It's nowhere near 1/4 inch, but thick enough. What about the steel? It's carbon steel, obviously. The weight rusted, it's pitted in many places. Still, it's not dying on you just because of a little bit of rust here and there. It's just as sharp as it could be. I got this knife and it wasn't very sharp when I got it. It smelled, you know what? It smelled like meat, like asado. Had been used clearly for that. Again, look at this. What is this? Is this fiberglass reinforced nylon with titanium coating? No, this is leather, guys. So talking about a knife that is probably 100 years old, this knife that you see here, if we go by some of the markings that it has, yeah, this isn't very accurate because this is kind of scratched in it, and some of the experts I talked with, some of the guys that are in the know-how, this is very questionable. 1867. Is that probably a year? It could be. Why not? It does look that old. It has our markings here, Sheffield, England. Maybe if you were able to read it. 100 years old? Yeah, very likely. This knife has been around for a while, for a very long time. So has the sheath. And this is leather. Pure leather stitched across. and you know what, it's still working, guys. Probably this got wet 1,000 times and it's still doing its job of what you can come to expect from a sheath. The sheath is typical of the South American type of configuration, which is this tongue so as to stick it across the back of across your back in the belt. All right, goes like that. So it's carried in the typical fashion used by the locals. Nice knife. I like it a lot. I like it because it represents for me some of those old values, those old traditions, and goes to show that some of the old stuff, it was done well back in the day and you can improve on it, but there's nothing wrong with this. All right, yes. Yes, the junglas with its coolest latest fashion technology and its Kydex sheath and MOLLE and all that stuff, it's great. It's better than this in terms of how long it's going to be lasting and the abuse you can put it through. But it doesn't mean that an old knife such as this one is of no use. And if you do this in modern days as well, it's going to be lasting 100 years as well if you're just barely careful enough. All right. Sometimes we're led to believe things that aren't quite so. We think that anything that isn't the latest technology is crap and it's going to be failing and dying on you, and that's just not the case. What about the typical bushcraft knife, the typical Scandi grind bushcraft knife that you see these days? This is what many guys that are in the know-how or are supposed to be in it, they say, well, this is the ideal bushcraft knife because it's small, this is too heavy, and because of that you're not going to be carrying it with you, so you need something like this. This is what a real expert in bushcraft would carry. Well, this is a Scandi knife. It's actually a Puukko blade. Puukko are Finnish knives that people in Finland did use a lot. Now, the thing that these experts apparently either don't know or don't bother explaining is that the same guys that carried this type of blade, what is it? I have a notation here. The semi knives, the semi people from Finland not only carried the smaller blade, they also carried a larger version of that, which is similar to this. This one is made by Condor. It's a modern manufacturer of knives. This model is the Kumunga, which has nothing to do with the blade itself. This configuration of a knife, this blade shape and this blade handle is typical of a Leukku knife, which is the larger version of the Puukko knife. So the semi people in Finland, they would carry both of these. They would have both. They wouldn't just go with this one, the one that you see in TV shows these days. They would have both because, of course, this knife is much more useful. This is, what is it? 10-inch blade, 4.6 millimeter thick spine. This is 1075 steel, stainless steel, but has a bit of carbon in it. Bit more carbon than 1055, a bit less carbon than 1095 steel. Great option in my opinion for such a blade. Guys, if you're in Finland and you're surviving in Finland, and if you look at the locals that survive with their, their reindeer guys, they would have this knife. They would have both of them, not just the little one. With the little one, there's lots of things they cannot do. They cannot cut wood with it. They cannot dress an animal, dress a reindeer, yeah, but up to what point? They would crush bone with a larger blade such as this one, and that's something that they needed and they actually had with them. The handle is not made of the birch, which would be the typical option for the larger Leukku knife. But it's plastic, just as useful. The configuration is the same. Scandi grind as well. It's hard to argue with what works. If you look at different cultures, you see that they had bigger knives. All right, they didn't have the smallest little blades that you sometimes see portrayed as as the ultimate option in terms of survival and bushcraft. And as I'm doing this so as to show you that there's nothing new under the sun. It's not. sometimes people think that the world began and it's going to be ending with them. The world has been around for a while. Big knives have been around for a while. They have been used by people for thousands of years, so no one is discovering anything. I'm just showing you what has been out there for a while that apparently lots of people have forgotten. What about a knife such as a kukri knife? Don't have an original kukri knife here, but I have the kukri machete by Cold Steel. What about kukris? Kukris by people of Nepal, typical tool used for everything in their lives. The kukri was more of a tool than a weapon for everyday tasks. Of course, it's an excellent chopper because of the geometry and configuration of the blade. It balances in a way that it's going to be chopping very, very, very efficiently. It got more famous as a weapon because of the Gurkhas, but locally it was more of a tool for everyday jobs. So what are your options as of today? Today, as I was saying before, you do have a big knife probably in your kitchen. If you don't have one, just go for it, buy one. You have some excellent options such as the previously reviewed Junglas, which I was showing you before, right? Junglas, excellent knife, 1095 steel. There's so much that you can do with this knife that you cannot do with a smaller one. It's gonna be chopping, which is what you often see people do on videos. It's gonna be chopping. You're gonna be able to chop through branches and small trees and such. But it's not just that. The big knife replaces in many ways what is capable of doing a hatchet, a small axe, a saw, a shovel for digging, a pry bar for prying stuff open or breaking your way through stuff. Those are all things that you're able to do with a large knife. What about defense? Of course it's going to be useful for defense as well. The gaucho, which I was talking about before, these guys were experts at defending themselves with knives. Even at a time when guns were already prolific, they would still stick with knives. It was more of a local thing. Guns weren't that popular. They were expensive, and ammunition was hard to come by. And if the Wild West was wild, the southern hemisphere, the South America, was even wilder than what you have seen of the wilderness in USA. There was less of everything, and you still had to get by. They were very effective at using the knife for defense. What about knife and gun interface? Did they cry when they saw someone, bring out a gun and they ran scared because you don't bring a knife to a gunfight? Well, I suppose that they didn't talk stupid back in the day. They had a bit more character, and doing research you find that usually you didn't want to mess with someone with a knife such as this one, especially if it was in the hands of a gaucho, especially if you were in close quarters where your gun was probably going to get you killed and stabbed with this thing. There's many stories, even in modern day, there's many stories of people that got killed with knives in spite of having a gun with them. Gauchos, they didn't mess around. If you had offended them in some way, you were gonna be getting into a fight. There was one anecdote that's worth mentioning. There was this the soldier from the militias in Argentina. He went into a pulperia, which is like the local saloons of these small places in the Pampas where there's barely anything, just that building where it's like a general store, bar, canteen, all pulled together. One of the gauchos was buying everyone drinks. He was buying drinks for everyone, and the soldier, he didn't want one. He didn't want a drink. The gaucho took offense in it, and he just charged with a knife. The soldier, he pulled out his gun. He shot him several times, but in spite of that, he got killed because got stabbed with a big knife, didn't survive. There was in my local shooting club in Argentina, there was this police officer. He was telling me once about something that happened to him. He was working in the the more countryside of Buenos Aires, where there's still lots of pampas and campo and all that sort of stuff. They were called to. There was like this party, like a barbecue, typical thing you see in the countryside of Argentina. It's usually like asado, people dressing like traditional clothing, and there's lots of people that, while not what used to be described as gauchos, they're still very much like those folks. He was telling me about this guy that they were sending everyone home because they had to stop that party. They had to send everyone home, get people dissipated. And there was this old timer, this old gaucho sitting in front of the fire. He was sipping a drink, and one of his officers he came to him. I think he was a captain or sergeant or something like that. And he came to him and told him, "Okay, what do we do with this guy? He's not leaving." He was just sitting there drinking, and he told me that he knew very well that that sort of guys, it's pretty dangerous, because if they get offended, they don't care if you're armed or anything. They will just attack you and probably hurt you quite a bit. So he got the Ithaca 37 shotgun, pumped around into a chamber, and at gunpoint he handed the shotgun to his officer, and while keeping him with the shotgun pointed at the guy's head, he asked very politely, very carefully, "Sir, could you please leave? We're trying to stop the party. We're sending everyone home. Would you please leave?" It was funny the way he told the story, because he said, in spite of having my other officer pointing the guy with a shotgun in his head, I knew perfectly well that he just got up and left because he decided to do so. It wasn't because I was forcing him. He was sitting. Yeah, one small detail. He was sitting in front of the fire with a facon, with his big knife buried in the ground right in front of him, and he knew that if he went for the knife and attacked him, he was pretty much in deep trouble. So, knowing the local customs, knowing the local culture, he knew that being very respectful and asking nicely was going to get him much further than just trying to force the situation. If you try to force that type of guy, you're gonna be getting into a fight. And he knew very well that even if you have a shotgun and a sidearm and everything, you don't want to get into a knife fight with someone that probably has been involved in many knife fights himself. So, just a little anecdote so as to portray things quite a bit better. What about, you're not a gaucho, you're not someone that's getting yourself into knife fights, you're just an ordinary Joe. Is a knife still that useful for you in terms of defense? And the answer is yes. Yeah, I know of several cases where people use knives effectively for defense in spite of being attacked by people with firearms. So there's a case recently, well, it was last year in Argentina before I left, a guy during a home invasion, a robbery in his place. He was attacked in his home by a couple of, I think it was two, I don't remember right now, I think it was three guys. The thing is, he had one of these blades, a facon. He had it for display only in his house, but he picked it up, and when he saw that they were breaking in, they were inside the house, he picked it up and he managed to stab two guys. They were armed, but he still managed to stab two of them and kill both of them. Yeah, a matter of luck for sure, no doubt in that. If you're getting attacked by two or more guys armed with firearms and you kill both of them with a knife, I'd say you were pretty lucky. Especially if this was a guy that wasn't into, he wasn't a ninja or anything like that, or a knife expert. He was just very scared, very determined to stop these people that had broken into his home. Another incident that I know of, and this one was from a guy that was, he did training with us in the shooting club where I went and took the classes I took. He was involved in a carjack attempt. There was two guys with firearms. One of them stood in front of the vehicle. One was on the side already, both of them keeping him at gunpoint. He opened the door, and when he opened the door, he slammed one of the guys with the door, and then he had a pocket knife. He opened it and stabbed him right in the neck, between the shoulder and the neck, went right in there, stabbed him, and took a hold of him. The other guy, seeing what was happening, just turned away and ran, left his partner there to die. Well, the bad guy that got stabbed, he died there. Yeah, well, this was a person that knew how to use a knife. He had taken some classes and knew exactly where to stab with a knife so as to cause the greatest amount of damage. And he took advantage of the moment of hesitation after slamming the door into the guy, grabbed him, stabbed him in the neck. Two guys with guns. Don't take a knife to a gunfight. Well, depends a lot. Depends if it's close quarters, if it's close confined quarters. Man, someone that has just has some knowledge on how to use a knife effectively against you, you're gonna be getting cut for sure, and probably get killed if he knows how to hurt you effectively and do it so effectively. You don't need to be Kali expert. You don't need to be a ninja to do it effectively. And is there a matter of luck involved? By all means there is. But I can easily keep talking and telling several other incidents where knives have been used, just as I can tell you of people that have died trying to defend themselves in such situations. I do know, though, that if you have some training, some experience, and lots of determination, and that little bit of luck that always helps, you have a good chances. And it's much nicer, if you look at it that way, it's much nicer, the odds you have, than if you just give up and just leave it in their terms. Let them just do whatever they want with you. You may end up regretting that, especially when it's your family involved. You may end up regretting that the rest of your life. I know that people that get killed, I'm sure the last thing they thought is, I wish I could have fought more. I wish I could have done more. I wish I had another chance to fight back instead of just giving up. So just a few examples of why it's an advantage to have a bigger knife, and why is it that that having the smallest little the punniest knife you can have is, it's not, it has nothing to do with Rambo complexes or anything. It's just that a bigger knife is indeed a more practical tool and has more capabilities than a smaller one. As I suppose I managed to portray in some way here, not only because of what may be your own personal experience, but because of what studying and understanding other cultures as well teaches us. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this rather long video. Gonna be letting you go now. See you in our next video. If you like what you're looking at, if you like these videos, keep in mind and maybe subscribe as well. See you in our next video. Take care.